Shana Tova. My dear friends, how many of you remember Yom Kippur of 1973? 50 years ago, on Yom Kippur morning, October 6, 1973, I was 14 years old. The sanctity of our holiest day of the year was violently and irrevocably disrupted when the armies of Syria and Egypt launched cross-border attacks through the Sinai and the Golan Heights against the state of Israel. And for the first 48 hours, the Arab armies experienced significant victories against the Israeli Defense Forces. But eventually their onslaught was thwarted, and Israel went on to defeat her enemies. Victory came at a very high price, however. The casualty count was unbearable. 2,656 Israeli souls were lost in the fierce fighting. In the war's aftermath, the transformation of the political landscape in Israel was swift and radical. The center-left political establishment upon which the nation was founded was dismantled, and a new era of politics was set in motion that ultimately led to the ascension of Menachem Begin's far-right Likud party. Walking into my synagogue as a 14-year-old boy, barely our bar mitzvah, on this holiest of days 50 years ago, and seeing and hearing television sets and radios blaring was an experience I will never forget. I remember how my rabbi, David Polish of blessed memory, set aside his Yom Kippur sermon and organized an impromptu emergency fundraising campaign. I remember the worry etched on the face of my parents and their friends who were desperately afraid that Israel might not make it through that first 48 hours. Many in our community at that time were survivors of the Shoah, and their fear was real, horrific, and ever-present. The state of Israel, you see, was the ultimate answer to their own experience of Hitler's evil, and on that day, all Jews around the world were united in love, concern, and support of the Jewish state. Well, much has changed since that fateful Yom Kippur morning 50 years ago. While Israel still faces military threats from Iran and its proxies, while the occupation of the West Bank and the military control of Gaza remain as flashpoints for both terror attacks and international condemnation, while Israel must continue to remain vigilant against the enemies that seek its destruction, it no longer faces the same kind of threat with which it was confronted half a century ago. It will not be caught unprepared. But despite Israel's current military and economic strength, the vision of a democratic Jewish state is threatened. Not from external armies, terrorists, or even diplomatic isolation. No. On this Yom Kippur, the very real existential threat that the state of Israel faces comes from within. And I believe, and I'm not alone, that this is the gravest danger it has faced in its 75-year history. Let me explain. As I've repeatedly shared from this pulpit, the current political leadership in Israel is the most extreme of any previous government. In order to gain a ruling coalition after the last election, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu joined forces with far-right, ultra-Orthodox, fundamentalist firebrands like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, both of whom have long rap sheets filled with violent, racist, Kahanist, misogynist, anti-LGBTQ+, and anti-reform Jewish statements and actions. In addition to plotting to weaken the Supreme Court, members of this coalition have pledged to expand settlement in the West Bank, cut funding to non-Orthodox institutions and organizations in Israel, remove protections for the LGBTQ plus population, limit the rights of Palestinians, implement far-right religious policies on everything from segregated transportation and cultural events to restaurant and bus closures on Shabbat, and end any hopes for a Palestinian state alongside Israel. I strongly condemn the actions of the current governing coalition in Israel, and I'm not alone in these sentiments. These concerns have been echoed by politicians and pundits, religious leaders and activists around the world and across multiple political extremes, from far left to mainstream right wing. For the past 38 weeks, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been gathering in the streets of almost every major city in Israel to protest the overreach of the Netanyahu government. And this past week, as the Israeli Prime Minister arrived in New York to address the General Assembly of the United Nations, thousands of American and Israeli Jews gathered outside Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza in New York to protest against the dangerous, far-right, racist, and misogynist policies that have been proposed. This was not a fringe group of activists. They were joined by leaders and representatives of many Jewish institutions, including the Reform and conservative movements. Israel is divided. Tensions are higher than they have ever been. Michael Oren, who served as Israeli ambassador to the United States in 2009 for Benjamin Netanyahu's then governing coalition, certainly not a left-wing firebrand, recently wrote the following: Israel stands at a fateful crossroads. In one direction lies chaos and conflict, and in the other, conciliation, prosperity, and peace. I call on all Israeli politicians to love Israel more than they hate one another, and to join in a national unity government that will reach a compromise on judicial reform, resolve the issues of Haredi ultra-Orthodox education and national service, sideline the radicals, and achieve peace with the Sunni world. Future generations of Jews are looking at us for courage. History will judge. Now, as many of you know, this past April, I was honored to serve as a delegate for the Reform movement to the World Zionist Congress. Now, some of you heard my reflections following this remarkable experience. I'm going to share some of my thoughts tonight as well. Now, the first World Zionist Congress was held in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. And it came about because Theodor Herzl called for representatives from Zionist organizations around the Jewish world to come to Basel to debate and to decide on the future of the Zionist movement. Today, the main purpose of the Congress, which meets every 5 or 6 years, is to set forward an agenda for education and allocation of resources from the World Zionist Organization and its affiliates, including ARTZA, the American Reform Zionist Association, Hadassah, B'nai B'rith, and other groups that run the gamut of ideological and political thought in the Zionist world. And as I shared this past April, upon my return, during the conference I kept hearing about 3 key values around which the foundation of the State of Israel was established 75 years ago: Judaism, Zionism, and democracy. And we use these words all the time. And yet, depending on who says them, they have radically different meanings. So let's start with Judaism. The modern state of Israel is a Jewish state. It was founded to create both a place of refuge and a center of holiness, education, and innovation for our people. And it has succeeded in ways that attendees at that first Zionist Congress in Basel 126 years ago could never in their wildest dreams have imagined. Israel has produced poets, artists, intellectual giants, and of course, technological innovation that literally has changed the world. And all these incredible successes have been a source of pride and are part and parcel of our Jewish identity since Israel's inception. And yet, despite Israel's many successes, the question of the role of Judaism culturally, spiritually, and theologically has become one of the greatest threats to Israel's stability, and some even posit its survival. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, deliberately avoided the question of how to define the Jewish character of the nascent state, other than to establish the law of return, which immediately granted citizenship to anyone who had Jewish ancestry. Questions of who is a Jew and how should Jewish life be recognized, celebrated, and defined were put off for another time. The chief rabbinate of Israel was granted limited but significant authority over life cycle events and Jewish identity. And the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community, was allowed to segregate themselves from many aspects of daily life, including serving in the Israel Defense Forces. Over the past decades, tensions have risen between the secular and religious communities. Ben-Gurion's avoidance of the question of Jewish identity, while prescient at the time, is coming back to bite us now. You see, the current government is attempting to codify religious exemptions to the draft and rewrite the law of return so that only those who fit a narrow definition of being Jewish would be allowed access to citizenship. This would exclude any non-ultra-Orthodox converts to Judaism, anyone who was not born of a Jewish mother. And my friends, this has serious implications for all of us. Jews who live active, secular, Reform, conservative, or even modern Orthodox Jewish lives could quite possibly find themselves without a connection to Israel if only some of these legislative reforms are passed. And as a result, we are seeing an acceleration of alienation from, dissatisfaction with, and most alarming of all, apathy towards the Jewish state. Which brings us to our second value, Zionism. One of the key takeaways from my participation in the Zionist Congress was the realization that while all the delegates and factions passionately believed in and supported the Zionist ideal of a Jewish state, their lived experiences, expectations, and relationship to both the land and the people of Israel vary widely, especially today. Many of us grew up with the image of a state founded on principles embodied by the Labor Party and the kibbutz movement. Leaders such as Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and others represented the triumph of the pioneering spirit that rose out of the ashes of the Shoah and built a country that would shine as a light to all nations, an example of strength and resistance to the Jew hatred that has plagued our people throughout history. But while the founders of Israel were mostly white, Ashkenazi, Northern European Jews, today's reality is different. Sephardic and Mizrahi, North African Jews, who for generations were relegated to second-class status in Israel, today have a powerful and growing political, spiritual, and social voice, as they should in a democratic society. And while the pain of the Shoah resonates throughout the land and is a central canon of our history, it is not a universally shared experience. You see, those Jews who came to Israel from Morocco, Tunisia, Yemen, Egypt, and other places throughout the Levant had their own generational trauma. Jews from Ethiopia and to a large extent the former Soviet Union are also appropriately raising their voices and wielding political power. The image of the pioneering kibbutznik hero is a part of the past. And until very recently, the political left has been in decline. And this may be changing due to the overwhelming numbers of weekly protesters, but we will have to wait and see what will happen on that front. And this plays out in multiple arenas. The progressive wing of Israeli politics has been largely overshadowed and shut down by populist, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian sentiment. And in addition, the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and the continued attacks from Gaza, propelled in large part by increases in Islamic fundamentalism brought upon by despair, has heightened security concerns, thereby reducing the size and the power of the peace camp. This brings us to the final value, that of democracy. Israel is a democratic country. Full stop. And yet, the process of governing in Israel looks very different than what we imagine takes place, or maybe should take place, in America, even during this chaotic moment in American history with all of its dysfunction. Israeli democracy is messy, it's loud, it's passionate, there's a lot of yelling. And we saw this in full force at the Zionist Congress, where bedlam frequently broke out in small group debate and the floor of the plenum. But it's also very apparent that Israeli democracy is under attack, and the few safeguards that currently exist are endangered. 75 years ago, after the state was established, war immediately broke out, and Israel did not have the luxury of setting up a constitutional convention. To this day, there still is no constitution. The Israeli Declaration of Independence and the basic laws that govern Israel have served as a sort of interim foundation for governance. The only check and balance that served to protect democracy was the Supreme Court, which has now been weakened by this government. Let me be perfectly clear. Debate over judicial reform is not inappropriate. It's worthy of a democratic state. The problem is that this current government is hell-bent not only on reforming the judiciary, but rendering it impotent against what many believe to be a corrupt and authoritarian agenda. It is for this reason that chants of "Demokratia" are echoing through the streets of Israel at the weekly protests. And while Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party did receive the slimmest majority of votes in the last election, after 4 failed elections in as many years, polls currently show that more than 2/3 of Israelis are against the radical plan to reshape the religious, political, and cultural character of the State of Israel. Nonetheless, Netanyahu and his compatriots are determined to bulldoze their agenda through the Knesset, despite the dangers it poses to both Israeli society and world Jewish partnership. A word now about those protests that have been taking place. These are not protests against the State of Israel. On the contrary, what we are witnessing is an eruption of Israeli patriotism. The weekly massive protests are not political in nature, despite the desperate attempts of Prime Minister Netanyahu to paint them as such. No, they are protests of love and concern for the very essence of the Zionist ideal upon which the nation was founded. And if we compare the number of protesters in the streets of Israel every week to their equivalent in the United States, it would be the same as 10 million people participating weekly. Think about that. The March on Washington at the Lincoln Memorial in 1968 had 200,000 people who gathered to hear the stirring words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 400,000 people marched through the streets of our capital at the Women's March of 2017. 500,000 people participated in the Black Lives Matter protests around the country on June 6, 2020. But nothing comes close to what we are witnessing on a continuing, every week, a continuing basis in Israel. Now, there are some who feel, perhaps some who are here tonight, that any critique of Israel from within the Jewish community, from the diaspora, is irresponsible and inappropriate. They agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition, who have consistently tried to paint the hundreds of thousands of Israelis taking to the streets on a weekly basis as traitors to the Zionist ideal, and those are the words that he is using. Even the increasing number of IDF reservists, former generals, and chiefs of the Mossad who are unambiguous in their warnings about the grave danger the current government's agenda poses to the safety, security, and economy, they're seen as illegitimate and are targets of vitriol and personal attack. Now, on the opposite side of the equation, there are many who feel, perhaps some of you here tonight, that Israel can do no right. They've cast their lot with the Palestinian cause and label Israel as an apartheid regime. Nothing short of dismantling the idea of a Jewish state will appease their opposition. But what concerns me most are those in the American Jewish community who are tired of hearing about Israel. Perhaps some of you are here tonight as well. They feel no connection whatsoever. Israel is just not important. And this, my friends, is a worrying trend. Why should we care about what's happening in Israel? We're not Israelis. I'll tell you why. Because when we see Jews carrying out racist, misogynistic, messianic, and fundamentalist policies, when we see attacks on women's rights, on Reform Judaism, and on basic human decency, when democratic values are threatened by greed, authoritarianism, and corruption, our tradition commands us to act. And also, if these initiatives are allowed to bear fruit, then, my friends, Israel will become a legitimate target of international condemnation. As my friend, colleague, and fellow delegate to the World Zionist Congress, Rabbi Ken Chasen, senior rabbi of Leo Beck Temple in Los Angeles, writes, when Israel is seen as a bad actor in the world, anti-Semitism increases everywhere. Jews everywhere suffer. We suffer. We become increasingly easily divided. We lose political power. We are targeted by hate speech and hate acts. You might wish to disown Israel when you feel it is misbehaving, but history has shown that the world will not let you. Tomorrow we will read from the book of Jonah. We will hear how Jonah was a reluctant prophet who receives a message from God to prophesy to the Ninevites and warn them of their destruction if they do not repent. Instead of heeding the divine call, Jonah runs away, but ultimately his fate catches up with him and he carries out the divine command. On this Yom Kippur, on this Day of Atonement, my friends, we are all Jonah. While we might want to hide our heads in the proverbial sand of complacency or run away from acknowledging that our beloved Jewish state is sliding towards authoritarianism, we cannot escape the reality that we are facing. We are inexorably linked to the state of Israel through our history, our faith, and our birthright. So what can we, as American Jews, do to address these very serious concerns on this, the holiest night of the Jewish calendar? Well, our first task is to recommit ourselves to supporting the state of Israel, even when we disagree. Please understand, our support must come from a place of concern and love. When members of our family lose their way, we do not abandon them any more than we enable their self-destructive behavior. Words of rebuke, even condemnation, must come from the heart. We show our love by showing our concern. And secondly, we must find a way to support the organizations and institutions in Israel that reflect our own values and are on the front lines of combating authoritarianism and promoting our equalitarian, egalitarian, and democratic values. And in particular, I want to encourage everyone to support ARTSA, the American Reform Zionist Association, and the World Union for Progressive Judaism. Following Yom Kippur, you will be receiving links that will tell you how you can show your support. Please be generous. I want to conclude my remarks tonight with a prayer written by a friend of our congregation, Anat Hoffman, the former director of the Israel Religious Action Center and a founder of Women of the Wall. She writes, "My God, at this sacred moment, give us hope for Israel and her future. Renew our wonder at the miracle of the Jewish state. In the name of the pioneers who made the desert bloom, give us the tools to cultivate a diversity of Jewish expression in Israel. In the name of our fallen soldiers, give us courage to stand up to the words and ways of the zealots, those in our own midst and those among our neighbors. In the name of Israeli inventors who have amazed the world with their innovations, help us to apply the same ingenuity to finding a path to peace. In the name of all these women and men, grant us the strength to conquer doubt and despair in Israel, replacing doubt with action, replacing despair with hope, and let us say, Amen." I want to wish you all a Gmar Chatima Tova. May we all be inscribed for a blessing in the new year. Amen.